Hi, it's Mary Rowe from City Talk and at CUI, and we were hoping to hear from Richard Joy, but we seem to have lost him at the very moment. There he is. Richard, over to you, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Sorry, I didn't catch my cue there, but yeah, my name is Richard Joy. I'm the Executive Director of ULI, Toronto, the Urban Land Institute, Toronto, and very, very pleased to be participating in this co-production of ULI Toronto and the Canadian Urban Institute. Not the first time we've collaborated, but the first time we've collaborated as a webinar. It's a great pleasure, as CUI, many of you don't know, but also happen to be in good times, our roommates. We cohabitate together on St. Patrick's Street and collaborate on other things, and now we get to collaborate on this. This was a very nimble webinar, to say the least. We brought together the idea very quickly in response to the news about Sidewalk Labs. Some of you from the ULI world have just heard a webinar, in fact, that just ended minutes ago with Dan Doctoroff and Amanda Lang discussing the rationale for the big news that we heard last week. So with that, and because we have such a hugely packed amount of material to cover with a big panel that's going to be very capably managed by Mary Rowe. I don't know how you do it, but one of 5 that she's doing this week. I'm going to turn it over to you, Mary, and wish you all best of luck, and I'll look forward to a great discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. We're always happy to work with our pals at ULI, and as he suggested, we are roommates. So at the time of COVID, being able to continue to be on good speaking terms with your roommates is a good thing. I'm the president and CEO of the Canadian Urban Institute, and welcome to City Talk. We're doing these a couple times a week, and as Richard suggested, for some reason, this is our May Madness Week. CUI is involved with 5 of these every day. So if you've got time on your hands midday, why don't you just join in every day to hear about some pressing topic in urban life. On Wednesday, we're doing one in partnership with a number of folks, including York University and the Goethe Institute in Berlin. And I actually won't be on that one, but everybody else will, and we hope you'll tune in on that. So today, as Richard suggested, we wanted to put up quickly a conversation, a space to have a conversation to try to make sense of what is the future for smart tech in Canadian cities. And we're very, very appreciative to have these 5 agree to come on in such short notice and help us navigate that. This is what City Talk seems to be about, is how do we make some sense of meaning and understand what's going on around us. Since COVID, CUI has put up 2 other platforms, City Watch Canada and City Share Canada, both of which are updated daily by partners and volunteers across the country. And if you have time in your hands and you can give us 30 minutes or an hour to watch one of those cities or the city in which you live and identify smart things that are going on, innovative things that are happening out of the community or business community or different sectors, please volunteer with us at covidresponse@cui.org. These broadcasts originate here in Toronto, and Toronto is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe and the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples. And it's now home to many, many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis people from across Turtle Island. Toronto was also covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties, which were signed with multiple Anishinaabe nations. And we are always cognizant and appreciative of our ancestry and the traditional lands that we occupy. And we also acknowledge that these conversations are taking place while we still have thousands of Canadians engaged in first-line emergency response, saving lives, keeping people safe, and we never want these conversations to be seen as supplanting that or in any way operating in isolation from that. And we have these conversations because we want, as I suggested, to try to connect the dots, but we are aware that particularly municipal governments continue to be under extraordinary pressure and other first responders working with them. These conversations are about practical things. What are we seeing? What do we see? What's working? What isn't? And what's next? And as we suggested, the departure of Sidewalk Labs, or the decision that Sidewalk Labs made last week, opened up a space for us to talk about where is smart tech and what is the future. And this is the beginning of a conversation. I know people familiar with this topic broadly aren't afraid of Twitter. So you can feel free to use hashtag CityTalk and engage there, and the conversation just needs to start here and continue. Also, we have a chat function, as many of you have already seen. And so what we'd like is for you to feel free to offer comments, all of you online, in the chat. You can offer comments, you can ask questions. Often people in the chat respond to each other more quickly than our panelists can. So it's a really good resource. And as I've said before, what goes in the chat stays in the chat. It's not Vegas. So just remember, you put something up there, it's going to be there for eternity, and we're going to publish it. And when you are offering comments, could you make sure that you offer them to panelists and everyone so that everybody sees it, so this hive mind can problem solve with you. We keep that chat function open a little bit afterwards, so the panelists drop off and go about their business, but the chat stays open. So if you want to continue to have a conversation, feel free to do so. As you know, we're recording, and we will post this chat, and we will post we'll post the session and the chat and a summary that we do after each session up for people to watch again. And we're actually finding that, and we have all the previous sessions we've done except for one. We have them all up there, and we're finding that hundreds of more people actually go and watch these things either again or get introduced to it. So please feel free to share it with your colleagues if they're interested. The reference to the Amanda Lang conversation with Dan Doctoroff will post, and we post lots of resources in the chat. So every time a panelist utters some smart online reference or a book or something, we'll put it up on the chat. And as I said, I want to thank ULI for chiming in and helping us with this one and making it happen. And we're really delighted to have ULI members on this session, and hope you'll tune into some more City Talks, as I suggested, usually Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. This week, every day. And always on Friday, we talk with the mayor about what's really going on. Okay, so it's a new day. Is it a new day for smart tech in Canada and Canadian cities? We're eager to hear what you say. And we're always happy to have somebody give us a perspective from a different place. And so Tara Pham is joining us. She's based in New York City, but she's actually temporarily in Palo Alto, I think. Where is it? California somewhere.
I'm in California. I'm in Tahoe at the moment.
Oh, you're in Tahoe. Okay,
Yeah.
Ralph, you're in Tahoe. Okay.
Yeah, it's terrible.
So talk to us. You know, you've got a really interesting perspective for us. And everybody here in this panel is active in the smart city and the smart tech domain, and has been for some time. You've got a lot of wisdom to share with us. So tell me what you've been seeing, and we're very interested to hear from California. What are you seeing as the impact of COVID on the sector and communities, and the relevance of smart tech now in cities? So over to you, Tara. Just give us 90 seconds on your perspective.
Cool, thanks. As just quick context, my company makes a camera-based sensor that measures all modes of transportation at street level. And we do that in a completely privacy-first way, but in order to provide more equitable transportation data. So we specialize in measuring things like pedestrian and bicycle traffic rather than just car counts. And what I've been seeing is actually really an uptick in interest in remote monitoring, understanding that I think a lot of cities actually need to provide more space for people recreationally, which in many dense cities means closing off streets to cars. And that's actually something that I think is exciting and maybe something to be optimistic about. So how I'm seeing that, obviously through our business, is cities want to measure that in order to kind of have their before, during, and after. My hope is that cities actually create some of these interventions, not just as kind of quick build projects, but actually as permanent changes to their master plans. And for us, that means it's not just traffic safety between people and cars, but actually thinking, how can we change the streetscape entirely, not to be so car first at all, but actually, if you didn't have cars parking and driving on the road, how can we actually make these spaces more enjoyable for people to be out with their families safely and socially distanced? That's really the point of it.
Is California trying to run you back to New York? You sound like a New Yorker there, saying that cars should be fewer cars and more people on the streets. Just asking.
I mean, actually, to be honest, New York City has been rather slow to adopt when you consider how dense it is and how quickly some other cities did adopt these changes. So in that way, I'm a little grateful for the pressure that this has created to act and really make some big changes to streets.
Yeah, you've raised a couple of points, which we'll come back to. One is measurement, the role of tech in terms of evaluating and hearing what is actually going on. And then secondly, what if it's going to stick? What if these modifications are going to stick? Okay, let's go next to Brian. Brian, you've got a storied history in this domain. What are you seeing? 90 seconds on what your perspective is.
Well, I'm sure we'll come back to Quayside details later to a degree. But on the broader market and the opportunities I've had to talk to a few companies under difficult circumstances over the last few weeks, I think what we are seeing is that anything that depends on new rounds of VC financing, anything that depends on large amounts of financing generally, which I'd include Quayside in that mix, is being reconsidered. And I think the good news for a number of reasons from that unfortunate problem is that a lot of companies, especially small Canadian companies, are starting to focus on moving as rapidly as possible to serving customers with the technology that they're developing. What I'm not seeing, and what's kind of frustrating for me and disappointing, is that my role in the Quayside debate was, I worked with the Board of Trade. At that point, we were very supportive of Quayside moving forward, but we were also extremely supportive of having strong federal regulation, something like what the EU has with the GDPR regime that's out there, so that innovators and citizens who are concerned about these technologies wouldn't be operating in a vacuum when people start talking about contact tracing and what's legal, what's principled in that environment. And here we are, we're now seeing that a furious debate is taking place about the use of those technologies, and the rules still aren't in place. So it's time for everybody to turn their guns away from hating the company of the month, like many did with Sidewalk, and let's get together and get a level regulatory playing field so that we know what the rules are.
Okay, so the whole notion of venture capital, what's going to happen there? And as you suggest, rules. Okay, John Jung, let's hear from you. What are you seeing?
All right. Well, as you may know, I deal with communities all across Canada, but also globally in various sizes, not just urban centers. We look at rural and small cities as well. And so, one of the key things that we're going to be coming out of this is the fact that people have to get engaged at the local level to develop their smart city plan so that it's a more sort of people-centric and holistic approach to what's going on in their communities. And many of them, particularly in the rural communities, are finding they just don't have the enabling infrastructure. They're missing that broadband, that essential utility that's missing. So how can companies in those communities even begin to do things and thrive? So they're forced to go into bigger urban centers where this is possible. And many of them don't even go to places in Toronto. They'll go into the United States or elsewhere. So we're losing that innovation. It's not only an issue of, creating a startup ecosystem. We have a problem with scaling. And what we need to do is look at all of the different tactics and strategies in our communities to be able to do that. And what I'm seeing is communities are beginning to not only look at the essential utilities that are necessary and infrastructure, but they're also looking at their strategy, not just projects. Everybody's now living in a city lab environment, right? We're all experimenting. What communities are saying, like I'm looking at a number of them, CUI did a smart city plan for Mississauga, for instance. We're working on others in Durham and elsewhere. I'm seeing that all around the world, that people are now saying, as they're coming out of that shock and rescue, let's reimagine our communities now from a different point of view. And I think you have some speakers here today on the panel that'll be able to talk about some of those things. We talk about open, resilient, ethical cities and so forth. So why not let's take a new look at how we should approach that now that we've come through this system of COVID and post-COVID there.
I think we're still going through it, I think, John. But I hear you. I hear the optimism in you. It's a moment, isn't it? Okay, Siri, let's hear from you, and then we'll go to Jean-Noé after you. Siri.
Sure. I think what I'm seeing, both at an individual level and on a community level, is that we are viscerally living through a sort of case study in the opportunity of technology and government and the threats and the concerns and the challenges of it, right? everything that's kind of allowing us to stay connected, to understand what's going on, to buy things, all of that is being enabled by technological tools. And that's hugely important. And we're seeing an acceleration in that. But we're also seeing the problems with it. We're seeing, we're understanding that, talking through Zoom is not the same as talking face to face, that working from home is not the same as working in an office, that when you're only using those tools, there's going to be a disproportionate issues of access and equity, that we're going to see only certain neighborhoods or, as the point was just made, certain municipalities who have the infrastructure, the tools, the money to actually access these. So we're living through the promise and the threat of these things, right? We know that they're necessary. I hate the terms, smart cities. It's about government modernization. Government modernization to me has always been about service continuity. You need these tools so people can access service, but you have to do it in a responsible way. You have to make sure that we're not just trading away all of that to one company, because we're also, I think, learning as a society right now, what happens if we decide I'm only going to buy things through Amazon, we are trading away our main streets, right? So we're all living through these things in real time right now.
Yeah, we are sort of a global pilot, aren't we? It's a global pilot project, or a global petri dish. Jean-Noé, let's hear from you and your perspective from Quebec and all the different communities you're working with.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you very much for the invite. So obviously, I think we all kind of saw that news last week, and I think for us, I mean, it's also thinking about, well, this isn't all about Sidewalk Labs or the Quayside project, but the Quayside project amplified and brought to light a number of different issues that were already on the radar, but really kind of accelerated or forced a conversation. And due to the kind of hard-fought mobilization that took place, I think we're in a better place now in terms of the discourse and the kind of the conversation around principles that should be underpinning our vision and the way that we talk and work through different decisions as it relates to open smart cities. And we've done an exercise of coming up with the Quayside project litmus test, or the Quayside litmus test, for example, as we learn from that experience, and how do we kind of work and support communities across Canada to mitigate some of those risks. And there's a lot that can be done, and I'm happy to elaborate on that. But maybe more to the point around like smart technology. When we talk about smart technology, we're talking about data, right? That's the enabling, that's the stuff that makes technology in many ways work. And so when we connect and observe the world around us as it unfolds with the pandemic crisis, there's a few things that we can kind of deduct and that we're already seeing. One of which is that the rapid pace of the coronavirus is not only testing the capacity of health system, but it's also showing how our data infrastructure is deeply fractured, right? And particularly inside communities as well, and in between them and across different levels of government. So we know that publishing reliable data requires time and resources, which communities, especially at this time, are struggling and hard pressed to be able to to mitigate the risk and to address health concerns. But this is a time for collecting and cleaning and standardizing data efforts with a long-term perspective, and really kind of charting the course of where we want to end up and how do we create a data environment that's rich for the future as we come out of this crisis. The key issue also that's been noted is the data privacy piece of the conversation. There's been a couple of initiatives and things that have come up over the last few weeks, kind of stating what are these principles, from a how can we be cautious about privacy? And so I point to kind of the statement that came out by Open Media recently, but also last week, there was a joint statement released by the federal, provincial, and territorial privacy commissioners with a reminder on key principles to consider. So that we need to really pay attention to that, because this is about compliance, and it's also about building trust and seizing this opportunity to have a new kind of conversation as we're, as citizens look to government for kind of competent leadership and responses. So this is the time when we can actually have a window to talk about privacy in ways that are new, that might have been kind of available to us in the past. And lastly, I think when we talk about a coordinated data response, different scales obviously apply. I think John made that point. And it's not just between cities or different levels of government. It's also, in this particular context, between neighborhoods themselves, and how smart technology needs to have that it's the economy of scale, but within kind of territorial boundaries of a city administration.
Okay.
Just,
so I'll stop there for now.
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, and just to cut in on one small thing that's a pet peeve. I'm not really disagreeing with Jean-Noé, but maybe supplementing in that and it certainly pertains to the Sidewalk Labs Quayside debate as well, is that I think one of the challenges with the whole so-called smart cities milieu or genre, if you like, is trying to define where that line is. I've never defined it as simply including data and software, although that's obviously the most controversial, most well-funded piece of this. But I think we're leaving a lot on the table if we don't take a more traditional management school definition of innovation to include physical technologies, improved construction, improved productivity in infrastructure construction, better and greener materials. That's part of the promise of this whole area, and obviously data and software is interlinked with that. But I would hate to go through the rest of the conversation nudging all of those off the table, because for me, much of what was most interesting about Quayside and much of what's most interesting about the sector is stuff that doesn't necessarily need advanced software or advanced data to be contributing to life in cities.
So I just want to agree with that, if I may, Mary, because for us, it's an open smart city. And when we unpack open, we don't just talk about data and the governance piece. We talk about, yes, the software, but also the engagement and the inclusive aspect of cities as participatory cities, as sharing cities, as well-being cities. There's a lot there. So we use the Open North definition of an open smart city that I can refer to in the chat here.
And John, I can see you want to get in. I just want to just interject and say, if we can try to keep the conversation as grounded in what we're really seeing, because I know that many of you have written about this. You've been talking about this. You've been waving around principles and concerns and all that. Here we are in a global pandemic. And if the tech community, I want to get rid of smart. I would love it if we could abolish this term smart. I've hated the hierarchical nature of that. But anyway, I don't know what the option is. I know, John, you chose intelligent, which doesn't really, but because I used to say I'm in for dumb cities. But can we have a conversation? This is a profound moment for this tech sector to make remarkable contributions to making cities more livable, equitable, resilient, all that stuff. And will your sector, do you think, live up to this? Will it deliver on Siri's language, the promise and the threat? Can we see the promise triumph? John, you go next.
Right. Well, we did get rid of the word smart cities about 2 decades ago, and we took on the word intelligent communities, trying to be more holistic. And where I'd like to go with this too is the question of talent, because when we're dealing with tech companies, you need to have the talent to be able to not only develop the innovation, but to run them, to scale up and do a lot of different things that we're able to do if you have the kinds of companies that we evolved, like Shopify, that came out of Ottawa's
Right.
Invest Ottawa company, and really look at how we partner with the universities and with libraries and maker spaces and so forth to actually bring that knowledge workforce to bear in Canada.
So John, rather than speaking aspirationally, just tell me, do you think we have that sector? Do we have the talent in
we do.
cities now?
We do. Look at the Toronto Waterloo corridor alone, the number of universities that we have in the area, and the kind of applications that take Waterloo. You've got the Communitech that works very closely with universities, with the companies, and then also engages the citizenry. So this is a thing called the triple helix or quadruple helix that they talk about in Europe and Asia and so forth. We have that here, and we have some great examples. And in Toronto, we've got some fantastic startups that are happening here and accelerators.
So let's talk about what happens if venture capital decamps. is that going to threaten the robustness? Siri, you were working for one of these big firms and trying to pull this together. Is the exiting of venture capital a bad thing? Is it a good thing?
Well,
what do you
let's
think?
see, there's not an exiting of venture capital, right? There's a ton of venture capital money. Part of the issue here is like, what are we investing in and how, right? What is the return? There was always a correction happening in tech in terms of the inflation we were seeing around companies that probably didn't deserve that. So I think there's a little bit of a reassessment of what VC where they should be putting their money, where expectations of revenue when it comes to investing in tech. But there's tons of venture capital money. The problem I think with this conversation and where we just kind of went is that we're still sort of segmenting, right? We're talking about the tech center and we're talking about smart communities. Those lines don't exist anymore, right? There's not a tech sector that works in one neighborhood that is one kind of person. Everything is a tech company right now. Every government has to have a layer of tech. Every company has to have a layer of tech. We can't act like it's a bunch of kids in a basement and whether they're going to help out or not. Every company is tech right now, and there are amazing things being done. There's amazing suggestions. I think the great thing about this, in how it is rallied what we would call the tech sector, is they realize that these tools can be used. They want to be a part of it. They're seeing that there's a line in, and I think to their credit, a lot of governments have opened the door on that, right? The provincial government in Ontario created a portal for tech companies to say, here's what I have, here's how I think it can be used. So I think there's a lot of great movement there.
What do you say, Siri, to this notion? I mean, you worked in municipal government and you've worked in a bunch of sectors. About John's point about enabling infrastructure. We continue to have vast parts of the country that don't have broadband. We're seeing people in library parking lots just trying to get Wi-Fi signals in their cars or in their standing there. What's your thinking about that? Can I hear you? You don't want to call it a sector, but could we? Is there a moment here where we're going to double down and say we have to come out of this with universal broadband? I don't know. What do you think? Is there a window?
Absolutely, and I think it's a hugely important thing in terms of equity, access, geography, but also in funding, right? And I think part of the problem, part of the reason that so many governments are behind on this is that there has not been funding for this level of infrastructure, right? So for 20 years, we have talked about, bureaucrats got new computers. That's such a waste. Who signed off on that expense, right? Why? That's gravy. Why are we spending money on this? When really, these are the tools that allow for service continuity, for us to actually provide the things that people need. So absolutely, I think the huge opportunity here is for the federal government to realize that, access to broadband infrastructure should be universal, it should be everywhere. We have a disparity in the city of Toronto. Imagine what that disparity is in Northern Ontario or in the north of Canada. It's completely ridiculous that that's not funded properly. And I think we also need an infrastructure funding stream that is about, the tools, right? Actually investing in the tools that are going to allow us to serve people in the best way possible.
So there is this tension between investment in big systems like universal broadband and all the big tech solutions, and then a company like yours, Tara, that's actually I'm assuming you're a relatively small company, and you're trying to have a catalytic impact based on the technology you're bringing into the market.
Yeah, well, I just, to Siri's point, I also just wanted to add, I think one of the talking points that we can use as communities is that actually improving our infrastructure helps our resilience. And one thing that we've seen in this pandemic is that, traditionally in my work, when I talk about resilience or I think about resilience, I'm thinking about transportation systems. So I'm thinking about green infrastructure and differently designed streets. But we also now are actually seeing that our digital infrastructure is part of a resilience strategy going forward. So issues of digital divide and making sure that we can engage communities fairly is going to be an important investment of governments. And, the fact that we have so many people, and this is, it sounds like in Canadian cities, definitely true in American cities as well, so many people that don't have basic access to digital infrastructure. We can't make the argument that we are appropriately engaging communities and getting community feedback if they can't even tune in to our community meetings. So
where do you see that getting solved, Tara? What do you think the solution is to the whole
well,
notion?
they are big infrastructure projects. I think, yeah, they are big infrastructure projects. So I think the question is, you know, how do governments fund this? And frankly, you know, I'm not an economist, and I do get nervous that right now in the US, and I imagine Canada is similar, like they're just blanket bailing out companies through this time. And so, you know, how do we actually reserve capital, or how do we finance these larger infrastructure projects after this bailout? That's a big question. I will say, back to your original question to me, one of the hardest parts about being a small company that sells to cities is obviously the procurement process. So I think one thing that is interesting to see in COVID is we also see cities flagging different purchases suddenly as emergency response. And I think that's actually a signal of maybe normal procurement processes just not being fast enough, or right-sized, maybe is a better way to put it. I'm for, you know, why we have various procurement processes and laws. It's so important. However, we've sort of overcorrected with anti-corruption laws to actually just favor really giant companies that can tolerate these extremely long procurement processes. And being a small company in that space, like, I will say, not to toot our own horn, but we operate more than 20 cities, and we're a total anomaly given that we haven't raised very much VC. We were lucky in that in selling to cities, we had something very unique and very targeted. But there are many strokes of luck that I can point to that we've had to make it this far as a company, and that included philanthropic funding, which is very difficult in general for tech companies to receive. Academic partnerships, definitely. So we need to find other ways to get, especially, I think, smart city or urban tech companies funding, because the truth is, I think being overly reliant on VC means that we're encouraging companies to have incentives that aren't aligned with the communities they serve. And so we need to figure out better ways of funding smaller entities who are not so bound, for example, to public stakeholders and communities definitely, but not, you know, public companies whose only stakeholders are driven by profit.
I mean, we have an initiative at COI called Bring Back Main Street, and we're very interested in whether local procurement policies can actually start to help stimulate local businesses. Jean-Noé, I know you want to step in. I just know there is some keenness on the chat here to talk a little bit about what do we see the impact of Sidewalk Lab's departure being on the future of the sector. And I want to, I guess, you know, I've been divorced, and so I know about starter marriages. And I guess I'm curious whether or not people have a sense collectively that did we learn a lot through the 2 years or so? And are we now ready to, you know, find our forever friends? I don't know what the right metaphor is. Jean-Noé, you go first, and then we'll go to some others who want to weigh in on that piece. Go ahead, Jean-Noé.
Yeah, I think there's probably like 4 key learnings that we can kind of deduct or extract from the Quayside project kind of experience. One of which is the question, whose data, right? That was really at the core of, you know, a lot of the issues that came up, defining what we mean by that. Is it public or private? This goes obviously to kind of regulatory frameworks, but it's also about different models of shared governance as well, which creates a lot of opportunities for innovative ways of integrating different perspectives in the way that we actually manage and provide oversight around decisions that are made based on data that's collected publicly. Then it's the open procurement piece. So we talked about procurement. So I think there's a huge now incentives that we've seen around like market neutral analysis. That's actually something that's a very, very high value and a lot of interest from communities to be able to do that well, to kind of level the playing field, operate in transparency, engage, having methodologies that are that enable you to make better decisions about the choice of solutions themselves. The digital divide piece was mentioned a few times. Well, that's a requirement now when we talk about the digital divide and what does it mean for engagement in the design of future cities. Not just participating in online conversations, but actually raising the level of education around the issues that are discussed in the context of, a framing of sets of problems that are not the day-to-day of most people, on
By the way, who are
basis.
you directing your comments to, though, when you say these principles must be adopted by whom?
Well,
Are you asking
I'm saying that
companies to behave this way, or are you saying government should, or what are you saying?
So, well, this is where we're at the crux of the supply and demand, right? Because there needs to be kind of a way that we're learning from, the procurement process from the city of Toronto and Waterfront, and how do we extract kind of learnings for cities writ large that are now, investing in new kind of IT solutions and smart tech and whatnot. So in my mind, anybody who's working with cities to do capacity building or, injecting even funding in kind of cities, we need to be extremely mindful of that open procurement or social procurement aspect of it.
So these
I think this by design.
These are principles that you would embed in the procurement process that a municipal government or a government agency would engage in. I know it's John was
correct.
Brian, I know you want
Correct.
to step in on something. Do you want to add some comments here about what we can learn and what does it look like now going forward?
Could go on for hours on what everybody can learn. I will not, but I'm not sure everybody has learned lessons yet, but the number one thing I'm certainly drawing my attention to in a similar vein, both as historical commentary to Jean-Noé's point and a lesson that governments can take from this, is that Sidewalk as a company was blamed and hit for a lot of things that were called for in Waterfront's original RFP. So much of this process has been governed by an RFP out of Waterfront that asked for the moon, asked for utopia, asked for comments on how the proponent would finance transit, build more efficiently, bring in new data technologies, plan a happier neighborhood, build more affordable housing. All of that was packed into this giant RFP, and then surprise, surprise, it becomes an unwieldy conversation just to get closure on the real estate deal part of this, which is where I think things really collapsed. A real estate deal which would have seen a company paying, close to $600 million in cash for public land that's empty, which would have been one of the largest, private purchases of public land of its kind in Canadian history. We're losing that money, we're losing the jobs, we're losing the profile. But I was always somebody who believed that the sector was strong enough, and I'm not afraid to call it a sector, that if we can have procurers, governments, businesses break up the individual ideas and lessons that were such a subject of debate with Quayside, and if we can have the federal government step in now, please, and actually create a level regulatory playing field so that nobody's wondering about privacy issues with the 500 other companies that are treading through this water, then I think we can still vault from this experience quite successfully.
So Brian, you're reinforcing the notion of procurement. Tara, just a sec. I'm going to go back to Jean-Noé because I cut him off and we didn't get your fourth point, Jean-Noé. What was your fourth point?
Well, the fourth point was integrated smart city planning in current plans. So that smart city planning isn't kind of a flashy project on the side here. And I think there's, I can see the head nodding here in terms of a bit of consensus, because we need to be able to understand and operate in the language that cities are working. At the same time, we don't want to be kind of constrained by that terminology at the detriment of creating new silos that could bring more inefficiencies within kind of urban planning writ large within city contexts. So.
Thank you. Tara, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so related to actually both of the most recent points from Brian and Jean-Noé, I think there's an exciting opportunity for cities to learn from tech mutualistically in an open forum. We are a vendor to Sidewalk Labs. We had sensors at the Quayside development at 307. And I will say, I think that Sidewalk actually did more vetting of our technology than any of our municipal customers around the world for the most part. And it was because of the public pressure. So I think that there, is opportunity and systems were created as learnings out of this. And And part of what was interesting about their process is we already existed as a technology that had a very rigid privacy by design policy in everything that we do. And what I liked about, you know, working with them is that they actually learned from us in that as well. They kind of surveyed what are best practices across the industry, and they took things that we were doing and, you know, extrapolated them forward, you know, more thinking ahead into city scale and applying the same level of rigor even to other companies, or I won't say our competitors because we're fairly unique, but certainly to, you know, maybe our peers in different verticals that have different applications. And definitely, you know, coming from that tech company perspective, I can say a lot of our job when we sell to cities is actually education. Many of the cities that we work with, especially smaller cities who maybe don't have dedicated data scientists on staff or technologists, you know, in this realm on staff, they're actually looking to us for answers about what are best practices in privacy. And so I appreciate when that's more of a conversation. And what I think Sidewalk did well when forced was to have those conversations in a public forum and present that information. And so hopefully, you know, that is a learning out of all of this that we can take forward.
You know, this is a dynamic that's been in cities forever between big, ambitious, what used to be called master planning processes versus smaller, more organic, hyper-local organic. It's often shorthanded about the Robert Moses, Jane Jacobs dialectic in cities. And I think that one of the dynamics we saw play out here in Toronto over the last couple of years was an apprehension about big tech and where the control, I suggest one of you asked whose data is it, that kind of thing. It raised all these questions about who actually owned things and who was leading things and was it usurping government, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think, gang, that is there an opportunity now for us to really plant a different kind of garden? I don't know. What do people think? Or do you think we need to find another large player? We see this in the ride-hailing services. Big players come in and set a standard. What do you think? Do you think we're going to norm into something different, Siri?
I think that was always what needed to happen, right? And I think that part of the problem with the conversation is that we acted a little bit like this conversation started, you know, began and ended with Sidewalk, right? Cities have always innovated. We've always been trying to find new tools. We've always had struggles with this kind of thing. I think for me, you know, the lessons out of this and the things we have to work on is that cities are really difficult, right? Urban issues are really difficult. And I think everybody learned that as a result of it. I'm so happy to hear how well they worked with you in terms of like, you know, figuring out, okay, well, how do we deal with all these different things? Because I think, you know, my experience with Sidewalk and with a lot of people who, you know, a lot of technologists who come into the urban space is that they haven't seen the complexities of it. And, you know, the most generous interpretation of government is that sometimes government moves hard or move slowly because it's very difficult, right? When you can't have unintended consequences for different elements of the population, when you have to think about equity issues and access issues and data and all those things, it's hard, it's complicated. So technology companies learning to work through these things with government is important because these are difficult issues, and not just the data pieces, but we're talking about building physical spaces, right? We're talking about building buildings and building roads and things like that. I think the other lesson here is that we have to do this and we have to beware of the land grab. And I think this is a threat that I see very much right now in terms of the conversations and the accelerated procurement that we're seeing. You know, the fundamental issue with Sidewalk, and Brian kind of alluded to this, is that it was about land, right? They wanted a big piece of land, not a little piece of land. For sure, everybody does.
They were offered a big piece of land that they bid on.
Well, they were offered it by somebody who didn't own it, unfortunately.
Waterfront does actually own that parcel. That's what makes Quayside.
No, I'm talking about the Portlands, though, Brian. That's
the extension.
Yeah.
But gang, if you took the land piece out of it, which I guess is the question, isn't it? Is it feasible to do these things without?
Yeah, and I think that that's the point I was trying to make, Mary. Is like, how do we define the land grab, right? So how do we work with amazing companies who are coming up with new ways of you know, measuring data and seeing how we're interacting with the space without trading away too much land? And by land, I mean just any kind of sort of real estate in the public good. And I think the other thing to your question is that there was never going to be one partner in this, right? Just like any other type of procurement, you're not like, oh, well, I'll just let this one company do all of the roads, or I'll let one company build all of the schools. That should never be the answer, right?
But we built cities that way. It's not, it wouldn't be the first time we've done that. We have suburbs that were built that way. and we live with the results of that.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. And so I think we need to recognize that maybe that's not the right path, and that, you know, we need to be finding the right partners for the right projects and be a little bit, I think the great lesson here is that everyone's been like, oh, this is actually a little bit more complicated than we thought. We need to actually go down a layer. We need to find a bunch of different partners, a bunch of individual companies who are doing incredible things, and learn how to work with them, rather than being dazzled by, oh, the smart guys from New York want to fix everything for us.
Although they could just as easily been smart guys from Woodstock, right? I mean, it's not just because I think we have to be careful about that. Canadians love to be anti-American when they're given a chance, and I don't think it's just that. But what do you say, Siri, to the notion that John said at the beginning, where he wants to see municipal governments develop plans? And I think, you know, Tara is saying she has to educate cities, and I think we all know this, that how are we going to get the right frameworks in place that Jean-Noé is saying is so essential? Can we do it more? Can we do it quickly enough, gang? Can we get equipped? Municipal governments don't have enough money as it is, you know.
It's the biggest issue. And just a quick point on this.
Go.
When I was in the mayor's office, it was a huge struggle for me that there was no bureaucratic equivalent to me who was thinking about these issues. There is a definite lack of capacity there. That's a huge problem. And the thing that I find strange about it, you know, and I had this conversation with the city manager at one point about tech, and he's like, well, I don't understand technology. I'm like, you don't understand how to build a swimming pool either. You couldn't build a swimming pool for me, but you understand that cities need them, that they need to be safe, that people enjoy them, that you fill them with water, right? Like, you understand how to procure a swimming pool. And so I think that absolutely, we need people in government who understand how to work with technology. We need amazing technology partners who understand that government is hard and understand that there are issues that they might not have thought about when they first developed their products, and be willing to have that conversation.
I want to add something to that point, which is that some of this technology is very difficult. Like, the thing that we kind of gloss over is actually to build in privacy requires more work in the R&D of the tech. And so making sure that happens at every level is really key. How we ended up with companies like Google and Facebook is that intentionally or not, some of their earliest data collection was kind of just, you know, they're Trojan horses. We're using their products, not realizing they're gleaning all this other data. So really, and that's why privacy by design is so important for us. We have to go so far above and beyond any old CCTV or surveillance company to do what we do well. So to Siri's point, having experts built into cities, I mean, I think more cities actually need that position of, you know, technologist, whether, and not CTO. The CTO of a city is often doing something very different. There are a lot of IT departments, but having technologists and even vertically focused, like I've had the pleasure of working with some technologists for the public realm, and that's like a very niche role that ends up being so important in the city.
Tara, what about that? Is there a way through COVID for the sector to be much more engaged in offering tech solutions and tech interventions to strengthen the ways in which cities are not functioning well? So issues of distribution, rather than optimizing for things that are nice to haves. I think that's part of the dilemma, is that if people felt that their sector was engaging in making cities more livable and resilient for vulnerable populations, for addressing some of the real Gordian knots we got, maybe they would be more inclined to welcome the interventions.
Yeah, so there's a bit of a conundrum, because the venture capital sector controls a lot of where tech goes. And unfortunately, they have a extreme distaste for companies that sell to government. And some of that is merited, because government is slower than, you know, a consumer to purchase, let's say. So I think there needs to be some reckoning there. I think also, cities and technology companies need to meet each other somewhere there. I don't know that this is the answer, but what COVID could provide is a little bit more urgency around certain things, and that would help both sides. But of course,
we are seeing in Canada government making decisions quite quickly about lots of key things.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen some mistakes. Yeah. I mean, I'll say on the US side, we've seen some governments really mess up, trying to move too quickly. So, got to be careful. But my hope is that we can find the silver lining in all of this and find the right things to kind of gain momentum on.
I think on that, Mary, I think the responsibility does lie with government to articulate what the problems are they're trying to solve, right? Because I think that a lot of tech people are guessing at it. They're like, oh, we have this thing. But fundamentally, a lot of the issues that government have are below the surface. They're not very good at explaining this is the problem we're having that we need to fix. I think now is a great opportunity, and governments are starting to do that, of like, oh God, we don't know how to communicate to this group, or we don't know how to manage this kind of, curb issue. They have to put those problems out there, and I think there's tons of companies that can help solve them.
One tactical.
Tara's going to reply then, Jean-Noé. Go ahead, Tara.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Tactical recommendation there is we've seen one thing that works very well is RFPs that are really focused on the end problem or the challenge and not prescriptive with the solution. And so that allows companies to get some background issue on the problem and suggest a solution that maybe the city staff haven't considered yet.
So we're back to procurement, the importance of procurement. On the way, and then Brian. Go ahead, Jean-Noé.
Yeah, so just to jump on a couple of comments that have been made. So in terms of problem framing, absolutely, I agree. However, I don't think that it should be government that only defines what the problem is for kind of procurement processes. We're in a situation now where there's a desire and a hunger for engagement, right? There's a proximity, there's a trust, there's a kind of dependencies that exist between citizens and their public institutions. They want to participate in kind of processes that enable them to provide their perspective on services that are better adapted to their needs and the problems that impact them like on a daily basis. So that's one thing. And then from an RFP perspective, well, this is an opportunity to built in, open source and open data as necessary, or when the opportunity is there for companies to compete, but then also benefit a broader ecosystem. And from a perspective of, a smart city discourse, well, there's an alternative model that's been promoted in the Canadian context for the last few years, and that's been through the leadership of the infrastructure Canada at the federal level. And if you look at the principles of the smart cities challenge run by the federal government on openness, integration, transferability, and collaboration, these are all things that those would have been the terms by which Sidewalk would have competed with with the RFP, we might have been in a very different situation than we ended up in the context of Toronto.
We have such an ambivalent relationship with risk taking in Canada, don't we? And who are the risk takers? And Brian, and then John. Go ahead, Brian.
One question I don't think I have an answer to in my head right now from the whole Sidewalk Labs Quayside experience is one that was raised by Jean-Noé a couple comments ago with respect to, I think the reason why Waterfront tried to be so ambitious with its RFP and the reason why Sidewalk Labs as a company may have been so interested in bidding there was that the RFP was consciously an effort to achieve the kind of integration that some were talking about earlier, in that the risk with being much more focused, as Tara talked about, which I think is probably the best of worlds we're going to get for the time being anyway. But the risk is you get a bunch of niche technologies that are kind of grafted onto an older government system and an older planning system and older construction methods and everything else, rather than actually integrating the digital with the construction piece, with the infrastructure management and maintenance and so forth. And so, part of my problem looking at this experience is okay, well, is that dead? Is there some other model where it's actually going to be, possible to get 3 or 4 different players, whether they're in the same company or separate companies who can serve those different public purposes together to be providing services in neighborhoods like this, so that we aren't in a situation where, my mayor's office experience is in Winnipeg, and the reason why they're always digging up the streets to put in another hydro line and then fix another water line and everything else is because all those layers of infrastructure were built separately, and they still don't coordinate in the 21st century. And that's the case where Mayor Tory right now is still struggling to get everybody to do their digs at the same time, to repair their infrastructure at the same time, and so forth.
You're reiterating Siri's point that we need integrated in continuity, and how does it improve?
We also need a procurement process that actually does that without burning the people who show up to bid with an integrated proposal.
Right. Yes, I hear you. Okay, Tara, and then Siri, and then we'll go to John.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was sort of the dream of the Quayside project, right? Was like, we're going to get to start fresh, do everything right from the beginning. And the challenge of working with cities is you have often hundreds of years of staggered innovation by proprietary companies, many of which don't exist anymore. And so now you're trying to make it all interoperable and easily upgradable. And it's just, it's difficult. So if I had to speculate about Sidewalk Lab's next step, which, like I said, we are a vendor to them, but this is just me personally speculating. I think that Quayside was a bit of a science project, and now they have to think about how to actually be a business. And that means building solutions that actually meet cities where they are, because cities are not where the Quayside proposal was, or, they're not starting from scratch. They're working with many, many layers, both physical, infrastructural, and bureaucratic and political. So,
we could go on this conversation a long time, and I can see in the chat box people raising a whole bunch of issues, which we're gonna learn over time what the implications are for what's happened and what we've all learned. It's not all going to be digestible here in an hour, 3 days after the decision. But I'm going to ask each of you just to very briefly, and I'm really cautioning you on briefly because we've got 5 minutes to go here. In terms of Canadian cities moving forward, and the promise, back to Siri, the promise and threat of smart tech, 2 or 3 key things that you would urge us to be focusing on as we emerge from COVID. John, you first, and really brief, 30 seconds each, basically. John?
What I was going to talk about was the need for us to recognize that this is about economic development as much as it is about getting out of this pandemic. The next steps, what are we going to be doing with that? We lost an opportunity to piggyback on some exceptional brand. That's really been important. But how can we now take this and really build an innovation hub or some kind of an opportunity that brings together real Canadian strength in the tech sector? And I think that was one of the challenges and something that we need to move forward with.
Brian?
I'm gonna go on what will sound like a tangent, but say, one of the most hopeful things I've seen in the last few weeks is the Mayor Tory and Deputy Mayor Annabilo pushed through a motion here at City Council where they're going to use modular construction to build affordable housing. And that's the kind of thing that Quayside was talking about in terms of their handling the construction side. It's the kind of practical innovation that solves a real problem by allowing you to build something you need more quickly. It's something other cities and other regions are far ahead of us on. If we can cross that bridge after years of dodging the opportunity to start doing that, then I'm hopeful that cities are catching the opportunity to actually use this crisis to start doing things more quickly and to integrate technology without assuming it's a utopian solution to all problems.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be one or the other. I mean, and even just simple things like providing connection between cities, so that, as is being pointed out in the chat by Kathleen Llewellyn-Thomas, who was in Vancouver at the time, Vancouver's been doing modular for 2 years, and here we are, finally Toronto's learning, and how do we accelerate our learnings? I think that's part of the pressure we may be under, is that you want every city to learn from what the Sidewalk experience has been here, and what are the things that we can extract from it. Sorry, that's me knocking my computer. Jean-Noé, 30 seconds to you.
Yeah, so we'll definitely be learning about Sidewalk for the years ahead. Obviously, you can anticipate a number of different kind of PhD theses that will probably come out of that
Right.
experience, and which is a good thing, right? And coincidentally, I think we also have in the Smart Cities Challenge itself, supported by the Government of Canada, other case studies like Guelph, like Montreal, like Bridgewater, that have abided by those values that I've described earlier. So for me, this is it's recognizing what took place, having an honest conversation, and then in the context of COVID, it's also about being able to adopt a mindset where there's a certain kind of tolerance for risk in the public, and actually speaking about issues that have a direct impact on public officials, as well as decision makers, elected representatives, as well as citizens, and kind of using risk as a trust and engagement measure there, and talking honestly about it. I don't think we have time we can't just kind of create internally, then deploy, and then ask for feedback. It doesn't make sense anymore in this context.
Has to be
so
integrated. Yeah. I mean, as you suggest, there's all sorts of risks that government is taking now in terms of how it's investing money, the decisions it's making about reopening, lots of things. Siri, and then Tara, you'll take us home. Siri, 30 seconds on what's the learning for Canadian cities?
I hope the learning is to, push past umbrella terms like innovation and risk that don't mean anything, and talk about what are we actually trying to do and what are we actually afraid of. So the two questions: to what end and at what risk? Let's actually be specific about that. What are we trying to achieve? For me, it should always be about the people, and that in terms of business or safety or whatever. What can technology help us achieve for the residents of our cities, our communities? And what are we worried about? And even if we don't know how to solve it, can we start talking really about what are the things we're trying to protect and work together to make sure that we do that as best as we can?
To what end and at what risk?
Yeah.
Right. Tara, last word to you from sunny California.
You guys took all my points. So the thing I'll add is I'm really excited about what legibility for city looks like, being able to access all this information, because both to Jean-Noé and Siri's points, actually understanding what is the risk and getting buy-in from communities to enable their policymakers to make those risks. The fear is that you won't get reelected, right? But if we can actually say, here are the values that we want to meet, and here's what we're going to measure to assess the success of a project, and if they meet these or not, and then make a call of whether to proceed or end it. I think that that's a process that we actually need to give our voters and our constituents the credit of understanding. And then the last thing I wanted to say was about inspiring people. There was a conversation briefly here about talent, and I think one of the saddest things in tech is that our greatest minds went to go develop tech for more clicks, and this is actually an opportunity for us to show people who care about technology how to give to their communities and actually build meaningful things instead. So hoping that this can be a catalyst for that.
Hard to imagine any challenge greater than a global pandemic to make us, we're all in the COVID business now, right? We all have to be about how do we respond to COVID. So on that note, can I just thank Siri, Brian, Tara, John, and Jean-Noé for joining us and helping us, as I suggest, make sense of this in terms of what does it look like, smart tech for Canadian cities with the departure of Sidewalk Labs. As I suggested, the conversation carries on at #CityTalk. We've been very happy to have you. Yes, we published the chat. Yes, we'll do a transcript. Yes, this video will be put up. And tomorrow, join us midday, where we're going to talk about infrastructure investment and stimulus with two former federal ministers who know how that system works. So I hope you'll tune in with us, and then tune in every day this week for another City Talk. Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Thank you.
Really important conversation.
Thank you. Thanks very much.